When Krivax had explained to everyone that he'd managed to find infiltrators approaching the portal hub by scanning Dalaran after hearing Mal'Ganis' testimony, it was enough to send them all scrambling. The dire news was impossible to hide from the staff and quickly sent the ADF headquarters into a state of chaos. Less experienced administrators, already stretched to their limits by the ongoing attack on Kultiras, panicked after learning that there were Scourge infiltrators in Dalaran. People frantically attempted to contact their families, started making foolish mistakes due to lack of sleep, and began running through the corridors in a hurry to get to their stations. Krivax did his best to project an air of a calm leader as he organized everything, but some of their frenetic energy was warranted as they needed to move very swiftly. Emergency messages were being sent via magic to inform the Council of Six about the situation. A messenger had been sent to alert the city garrison, and Krivax had even sent one of his guards to muster the Nerubian enclave to help defend Dalaran. Unfortunately, all of these things would take time that they did not have. The paths taken by the Scourge infiltrators were approaching very close to the city's critical defense infrastructure. As such, Krivax had urgently gathered every combat-capable member of the ADF into an ad hoc squad to hold off the enemy forces until reinforcements arrived. This group included himself, Romarth, Ionaya, Illidan, his remaining guards, a half-dozen sentinels, and a few other miscellaneous individuals in their headquarters. Krivax was tempted to leave Magister Romarth to handle the frenzy, but the Magister was needed as he was both skilled enough and had the necessary permissions to teleport within the city's limits. This meant he would be able to position the assembled group to intercept the Scourge infiltrators. The only difficulty was choosing which group of infiltrators they would be confronting. It's faint. Much more so than the enemy group near the portals, but I can just barely feel a demonic presence moving through the Violet Citadel, Krivax reported grimly, not at all happy to have his fears confirmed. A dreadlord then, said Illidan, his voice containing a mixture of excitement and grim determination. One who intends to take control of the city's wards. The Burning Legion's tactics haven't changed in the slightest since the War of the Ancients. Krivax's heart dropped as he imagined what would happen if the Scourge succeeded in their plans. Dalaran's anti-spatial magic wards emanated from the Violet Citadel, preventing hostile forces from teleporting whoever they wanted into the city. If they were able to seize control over those wards while simultaneously cutting off Dalaran from the rest of the world, the consequences would be catastrophic. The Scourge would be completely free to open a portal into the city and allow their forces to pour in while the Alliance would be prevented from mounting an effective defense. It would be a slaughter. We need to focus on stopping one prong of their plan, said Magister Romarth, his normally composed demeanor strained by the gravity of the situation. Dalaran is only at risk of falling if both the portal hub and the wards are compromised. So long as we defend one, there is little the Scourge can do before the Council of Six intervenes. I suggest that we go to the Violet Citadel. It is far more defensible than the portal hub. I'll never refuse the opportunity to slay one of the Burning Legion's dogs, said Illidan, the fell green orbs behind his blindfold growing brighter with a deep desire for violence. Krivax knew that there were few things that Illidan hated more in the world than demons and that he saw it as his purpose in life to destroy the Burning Legion. Should Magister Romarth teleport them to the Violet Citadel, he had no doubt that Illidan would absolutely tear the Dreadlord apart in short order. That course of action was likely the objectively correct decision from a strategic perspective. But there was a small problem with that. If we go to the Violet Citadel, then a lot of people are going to die, said Krivax, his words immediately drawing the attention of everyone in the room. Not only are there more enemies in the group heading toward the portal hub, but one of them is absurdly powerful. If they go on a rampage, then it wouldn't be out of the question for them to slaughter hundreds of civilians and raise them as undead before we can respond. Krivax couldn't help but shudder as he remembered the faint glimpse of potent necrotic magic that he'd sensed beyond the concealment magic. If scrying and scouting hadn't already confirmed that the Lich King was stuck in a block of ice near Shenzhen Su's head, then Krivax could have sworn that he'd sensed the leader of the Scourge himself. However, since it was Gul'dan who had become the Lich King rather than Nersu, it made matters much more uncertain. There was no telling what abilities such a powerful warlock may have manifested after becoming the Lich King that a shaman like Nersu never did during the original timeline. Although, Krivax speculated that Gul'dan was likely the type to favor his personal power. It's slightly riskier, but I'm fairly confident that Illidan is the only person strong enough to counter that threat, Krivax continued, knowing that he would need to explain further if he wished to convince them. Dreadlords tend to prefer subtlety rather than needless slaughter, so it's unlikely that they kill any more than necessary to achieve their goal. Besides, there's a good chance that Team Ronin and the city garrison will be able to prevent them from seizing the city's wards for long enough for reinforcements to arrive. Fortunately, the Kirin Tor had been wise enough to leave Archmage Cedric behind to head the city garrison, so Krivax genuinely thought the Dreadlord could be dealt with without them. He could tell that his argument was enough to persuade Illidan. However, he could also tell that Illidan was less than pleased with this arrangement. So, you would accept a greater risk that the entire city falls just to protect a few hundred lives? Illidan said, his expression contemptuous. To be a leader is to make difficult decisions. This weak-willed nonsense will bring nothing but disaster. A part of him agreed and wanted to defer to Illidan's vastly greater experience in dealing with matters such as this. But Krivax couldn't bring himself to do so. Illidan may have been instrumental in defeating the Burning Legion during the original timeline, but Krivax couldn't ignore the many times the reckless and obsessed Night Elf's decisions had caused irreparable harm. Sometimes, the so-called difficult decision was merely a convenient excuse for callousness, and Krivax didn't want to go down that route. He still regretted the tremendous loss of life when the Cathrax had attacked the Lordaeron capital city. He could only hope that he wouldn't live to regret it. I understand that it's a risk, but we have a duty to do what we can to protect the people of Dalaran, said Krivax, meeting Illidan's gaze directly without hesitation. With your help, we shouldn't have much trouble defending the portal hub from the Scourge, unless you lack confidence in our ability to stop them? I doubt nothing, aside from your strategic acumen, Illidan responded with scorn before pausing to take a deep breath. However, I will follow your lead in these matters, and we will see what comes of this decision. Krivax wanted to say more, but they had very little time to waste. Magister Romarth, please teleport us now, said Krivax, turning toward the High Elf. I can feel them approaching the portal hub. We must leave now if we're going to prevent them from entering the building. Magister Romarth nodded gravely and instructed everyone to gather around him as arcane energy began swirling around him. After several moments, the spell was completed and Krivax felt the familiar sensation of spatial magic wrapping around their group and pulling them to the other side of Dalaran. Almost immediately, they were greeted by the sight of startled Kirin Tor guards who had yet to be informed of the current emergency. They were brandishing spears at them with wild-eyed expressions. Halt! Spatial magic in this area is permitted only to authorized members of the Kirin Tor, one of the guards said immediately, hesitating only briefly when got a good look at their group. Present your credentials and allow yourselves to be examined for illusionary magic, or prepare to face immediate detainment. Krivax was torn between appreciation that the Kirin Tor guards were performing their duties so diligently and frustration at the waste of crucial time. Given how on edge the Alliance was due to the war, all of the guards were extremely tense, ready to attack at a moment's notice. As the only person in their group who was technically a member of the Kirin Tor, Magister Romarth was quick to step forward and present his credentials, a shimmering badge imbued with magic denoting his position. Are you the commander of this post? Magister Romarth asked the guard that had addressed them, a broad-shouldered human who introduced themselves as Commander Reynolds. Gather your forces and prepare to defend this location. The Alliance Defense Force has reliable reason to believe that it is about to be attacked by powerful Scourge infiltrators. Please instruct them to avoid alerting the enemy before they enter the building, Krivax added quickly before the commander could send out orders. We want to prevent fighting in the streets as much as possible in order to limit civilian casualties. It would be best to trap them inside and then strike. And bring me some weapons, Illidan said while scowling contemptuously toward his sentinel guards, who immediately began protesting. "That is, if you truly wish for me to be of any use." Krivax was truly glad that every nation in the Eastern Kingdoms had decided to place their garrisons on high alert, because the commander merely nodded without complaint and immediately began shouting orders to his subordinates. Fortunately, the portal hub was built somewhat with defensibility in mind to prevent unauthorized individuals from easily leaving or entering Dalaran, so it only had a single entrance and sophisticated wards. This meant all of the civilians who happened to be inside could be quickly and efficiently evacuated to a safer part of the building, while the defenders took positions near the entrance to create a choke point. Meanwhile, Krivax and Illidan both made their way to a nearby room away from the entrance. There was a significant possibility that the Scourge could potentially notice the very distinctive fel or life magic emanating from them, so they needed to go somewhere where they wouldn't immediately be detected. Naturally, the Sentinels refused to leave Illidan's side and joined them as well. Once they were there, Krivax cast a scrying spell over the portal hub's entrance while Illidan concealed their presence with his own spell. There was a decent chance that the Scourge would notice that they were being scryed, but they would probably not realize that their cover was blown. It wasn't out of the ordinary for critical infrastructure to be under constant monitoring, especially during such tense times. Chances were that they'd simply planned to push their way through an unprepared defense force before any reinforcements could arrive. Unfortunately for them, that wasn't going to be allowed to happen. While it felt longer, it had only been around 10 minutes from the moment Krivax had first sensed the Scourge's presence to when they were fully prepared to fend the portal hub. The speed and sense of purpose with which everyone moved was impressive, and Krivax saw nothing but determined expressions as he steeled himself for battle. He could even sense that the city's garrison was responding quicker than expected, and were already converging on the Violet Citadel. "What do you know of their capabilities?" asked Illidan, his tone serious and sober as he took a few swings of the enchanted blades provided to him by the guards. Something about the Night Elf's demeanor had changed dramatically. His typical arrogance and self-assuredness had been replaced with the sharper, more lethal focus of a lifelong warrior preparing for battle. "Very little, other than that their leader is frighteningly powerful and that they are likely all undead," Krivax replied as he monitored the street outside of the portal hub via scrying. There were fewer civilians out there than usual due to Dalaran's heightened state of security and the general sense of unease in the city. However, there were still far too many in the streets for Krivax's tastes. He wished that he could warn them and tell them to take shelter, but it was more important that the Scourge wasn't alerted too early. It wasn't long before the group of Scourge infiltrators stepped into range of his scrying spell. There were 8 of them in total, all ostensibly appearing like normal Dalaran citizens of various races, merely seeking to travel to one of the Alliance's major cities. Their leader looked like a human man with a calm expression and wore the robes of an apprentice mage. He moved with strange grace, and his presence emanated a sense of authority that couldn't be hidden behind the concealment magics that shrouded him. Illidan gave a curt nod. "I suppose it doesn't matter. Even if they aren't demons themselves, the Scourge is merely another facet of the Burning Legion and will crumble before me." Krivax didn't react to Illidan's proclamation and instead focused on the incoming Scourge. They were approaching at a casual pace and would hopefully be successfully lured into the building further away from Dalaran's busy streets. At least, that was their goal, but it became obvious that something had gone wrong when the leader of the Scourge infiltrators suddenly stopped the moment he stepped through the portal hub's entrance. Krivax let out a short curse as he watched the guard commander approach the infiltrator with a smile on his face, clearly intending to play the part of the friendly greeter. "Good evening, sir. Is there an issue?" the guard commander inquired, feigning ignorance. A part of Krivax didn't expect the Scourge leader to actually respond and instead just immediately attack, but he was pleasantly surprised when the man gave a slight smile, never breaking character. "Ah, good evening," the Scourge leader replied, his voice calm and smooth. "I apologize for me and my group blocking the entrance. I was just momentarily taken aback when I didn't see any other travelers and that the wards were more intense than I expected. Has something happened?" The guard commander, to his credit, didn't falter. The ongoing conflict with the Scourge and their attack on cultivators has placed all major cities on alert. We have decided to take extra precautions just to be safe. As for the lack of travelers, it's simply a lull in traffic. Please follow me so that we can get you all processed quickly and safely. There was a tense moment when the guard commander began moving further into the compound with the expectation that he would be followed, only for the Scourge group to remain completely stationary with suspicious gazes. Krivax's heart pounded as he let out a curse, fearing that they'd been discovered. He could feel Illidan and the sentinels tensing next to him, ready to dash out of the room at a moment's notice. Just as it seemed that the Scourge finally started following and moving further into their trap, Krivax was momentarily distracted as he sensed Dalaran's garrison close in on the demonic presence in the Violet Citadel. A second later, there was a potent clash of fell magic and arcane magic indicating that a fierce battle had begun in the heart of the city's fortress. The Violet Citadel was reasonably far from the portal hub, and nobody but Krivax should have been capable of sensing the fight taking place there, but he knew that assumption was wrong when the Scourge leader suddenly stopped again. "Shit. Move." Krivax called out, already rushing out of the room. He was barely able to make it in time to throw out a stream of life-infused flames that clashed against the overwhelming wave of necrotic energy unleashed by the Scourge leader. Even then, he was only able to save about half of the Kirin Tor guards who were positioned further away from the entrance. The ones closer, including the guard commander, were killed nearly instantly. Their hastily erected arcane barriers shattering and their flesh rotting away in mere moments. Before their bodies could even fall, their eyes began to glow malevolent blue light as they fell under the control of the Scourge. The magic concealing their enemies had fallen away, revealing them all to be Pandaren monks, their bodies showing obvious signs of decay and emanating necrotic magic. Each of them carried staves made of blackened bone, decorated with glowing blue runes that pulsed with the same unnatural light as their eyes. They wore dark, tattered robes that flowed eerily, as if touched by an otherworldly wind. Krivax had expected to see malicious and twisted expressions, but they instead all carried an unnerving serenity that felt completely out of place. All of them except for their leader. The elderly male Pandaren stared at Krivax specifically with an eerie intensity. His eyes were a deep, dark void that seemed to draw everything in, and the necromantic magic emanating from him was unlike anything Krivax had ever encountered, drowning out all other sensation. When he spoke, his voice was as if two different people were speaking in unison, with the deeper of the two sounding like something from the abyss itself. All of this, along with utter hatred and focus with which he looked at Krivax, was enough for him to conclude that the undead monk was somehow being possessed or empowered by the Lich King. Gul'dan was the only individual who had reason to hate him so intensely, and emanate that kind of power. A part of him was surprised given that the Lich King hadn't manifested this kind of ability during the original timeline, but it made sense that a warlock as hungry for control as Gul'dan would develop such a power. "You," said Gul'dan through the undead monk he was possessing, voice filled with more hatred than Krivax had ever heard. Before Krivax could react, everything turned into a flurry of movement as Illidan burst forward, twin blades glowing with fell energy as he sliced through undead mages with expert precision. From there, things took a turn for the worse when the monks jumped back with impressive speed, with the screaming of civilians soon following as they retreated to Dalaran's busy streets. Illidan immediately chased after them, with Krivax and everyone else quickly following. It became clear why the Scourge had chosen to fight outside when he saw bystanders being killed and raised as undead while the monks dexterously jumped between buildings, leaving chaos in their wake. Men, women, and children were all running in terror as their once familiar city streets turned into a horrifying battleground. With each dead civilian, the Scourge swelled in number and their relentless assault risked growing out of control. Illidan was already engaged in close combat with the Lich King, each of them a blur of motion that sent fell and necromantic energies exploding with each clash, while the other undead monks were free to run rampant. It was good that the enemy was being moved away from the portal hub, but Krivax couldn't help but feel a wave of fury at the sight of innocent people being killed for little more than a distraction. Focus on the monks and get the civilians away. Reinforcements are on their way. Krivax yelled, directing the combatants running out of the portal hub as he began casting a short-ranged teleportation. A moment later, he disappeared and reappeared in a flash of violet light in between one of the undead monks and a gnome woman who was desperately trying to shield her child. "Get out of here!" Krivax yelled to the civilian as he summoned his silk golem right before the monk was about to strike. She reacted with impressive reflexes, allowing her to barely avoid being grabbed by the golem before leaping away from the burst of flames Krivax sent her way as the gnome family ran for cover. As she landed, a group of the Kirin Tor guards immediately launched a barrage of various spells at her from every angle while Krivax's bodyguards charged her spear first, only for the undead monk to summon a shroud of dark mist that seemed to absorb all of their attacks and hide her from view. A few seconds later, she surged forward while ignoring the spear buried in her chest straight into the group of soldiers. Many of them put up a good fight, burning through chunks of the death monk with fireballs or otherwise injuring her with enchanted blades, but the undead paid no mind to her injuries. The undead exploited her resilience to unleash a series of rapid, graceful strikes as dark magic flowed from her staff. The few blows that didn't outright kill a guard resulted in them being sapped of their very life force, leaving them withered husks. When her mist dispersed a moment later, it revealed that Krivax's personal guard had suffered a similar fate, the corpses of several elite Nerubian soldiers littering Dalaran's street. The sight reminded Krivax vividly of the Horde's Death Knights during the Second War, except that these undead Pandren were far more deadly than even them. Given that Gul'dan was the original creator of the Death Knight, it wasn't surprising that this new type of undead, which he couldn't help but call death monks in his mind, held such a horrifying level of power. Understanding that he would have to find a way to keep the death monk from escaping if he wanted to actually deal with her, Krivax took a different course of action the next time he teleported himself and his golem next to her. While she easily managed to dodge his golem for a second time, Krivax paid that little mind and unleashed a nova of ice magic that froze the entire area around them solid. Every surface, from the ground to the surrounding structures, was turned to ice, causing the monk to lose her footing. Seizing the opportunity, Krivax's silk golem swung down at the monk with a blow that they hastily tried to avoid, turning an attack that would have shattered her skull into one that merely took most of the left side of her body and destroyed her staff. However, this attack that would be guaranteed to kill a normal person was a mere inconvenience to the monk as she jumped up and grabbed a stone chunk from the shattered road before hurling it at Krivax's eyes with ridiculous precision. Such an attack naturally wasn't enough to pierce Krivax's magical defenses, but it distracted him enough that the monk was able to close in on him. Even with only a single functional arm, the undead's movements were still incredibly fluid and precise, managing to strike Krivax in a way that sent necromantic magic flowing into his body. He could instantly tell that he would be in extreme danger if not for Alexstrasza's empowerment, but as it was, he was merely staggered. The life magic acted like potent antibodies against an infection, protecting him from harm. This was clearly not what Krivax's opponent was expecting, and he exploited her surprise by simultaneously casting a geomancy spell that shook the earth beneath her feet and lunged forward to grab the monk. He wouldn't normally have been able to successfully catch such an agile opponent, but the combination of the icy terrain and being knocked off balance made it impossible to dodge in time. This meant Krivax was free to completely engulf the monk in life-infused flames that ate away at the necromantic magic animating her. The serene expression that the undead Pandaren had worn throughout their entire confrontation was immediately replaced by one of agony as she did everything she could to escape his grasp. Krivax merely ignored her thrashing and occasional strikes until the only thing left of her was a pile of ash. That took far too much effort for some nameless underling, Krivax thought as he let out a sigh of relief. The Scourge must have truly sent some of its strongest agents for this mission. Turning his attention to the rest of the battlefield, Krivax became further convinced of this conclusion. The streets had cleared of civilians by now, but the surrounding buildings had been devastated as each of the death monks held their own against multiple Kirin Tor guards. The sentinels, fewer of them remaining than he remembered, had taken position to the rear and were doing their best to support the beleaguered mages with their archery. Honestly, it was likely that Ionaya was the only reason the Death Monks hadn't managed to simply run past them all and attack the portal hub. The Titanic Watcher had shed her mortal form and was towering over the structure's entrance, her massive mace deterring any undead that approached as her inorganic body protected her from any necromantic attacks. The number of dead was genuinely shocking, but Krivax could tell that the Scourge was extremely unlikely to actually achieve their goal. Despite the portal hub only having a few dozen Kirin Tor guards, each of them fought valiantly in the face of such a powerful foe while more and more arrived with every moment. Krivax could sense reinforcements quickly converging on their location, and even see a few Nerubian warriors from the enclave crawling over buildings as they made their way to the battlefield. While the Scourge infiltrators were powerful, they simply lacked the numbers to put up a prolonged resistance, and several of them had already been destroyed. The Lich King must have also realized the same thing, because the undead he had possessed suddenly scowled and let loose an explosion of dark magic that sent Illidan flying away from him, before retreating toward the southern side of the city. Every single undead followed after him in a synchronized movement that made it clear they were being puppeteered much more directly than the typical Scourge minion. Krivax wished that he could believe that Gul'dan was retreating due to his outmatched forces, but he could feel the Scourge heading toward a very important structure. After them, quickly. They're headed for the Violet Hold, Krivax shouted, realizing the magnitude of the threat. The Violet Hold was not only a high-security prison, but also housed incredibly dangerous creatures that were imprisoned by the Kirin Tor primarily for research purposes. Should Gul'dan successfully release them, then Dalaran would suffer immense casualties before they could be contained. The rush to the Violet Hold was a blur, with much of the city in a state of chaos as civilians attempted to get to shelters, clogging up the streets while the garrison attempted to establish some semblance of order. Both their fight with Gul'dan and the confrontation at the Violet Citadel were both very loud, causing the sounds of explosions to echo throughout Dalaran. Ionaya stayed behind to ensure none of the Scourge attempted to double back and attack the portal hub. As they approached, it was obvious that the Lich King was already at work as the guards who had been stationed at the Violet Hold had already been turned into undead, joining the other Scourge minions. The formidable prison's entrance had been blasted wide open, wisps of necromantic magic still lingering in the air. It took only a moment for Illidan to cut down the undead with contemptuous ease, allowing them to enter the prison. Inside the Violet Hold, the scene was exactly as Krivax had anticipated, with many of the containment cells shattered and their inhabitants free to wreak havoc. Magical criminals, monstrous creatures, and the Scourge were fighting against the Kirin Tor. It was unfortunate that Archmage Kel'Thuzad and Queen Kithix were not present in their labs in the Violet Hold, as they would have been extremely helpful in dealing with the undead. However, there was no sight of the Lich King, likely because they had gone deeper into the prison to free its most dangerous inhabitants. Krivax attempted to use his sensory abilities to locate the undead being possessed by Gul'dan, but found that the entire structure was covered with so much death magic that it was like trying to find a single grain of sand on a beach. Krivax fully intended to stop that from happening, so he immediately gathered deep into his reservoir of life magic and let loose an inferno that completely engulfed all the undead in the way of the path leading deeper into the Violet Hold. "Follow me deeper into the prison," said Krivax, addressing Illidan as the Night Elf and his remaining sentinel guards regarded him with a faintly impressed expression. "I doubt I'll be able to handle the Lich King alone, and the majority of the Kirin Tor will need to stay here to contain the prisoners." For a moment, Krivax wasn't sure if Illidan would follow his lead, given how arrogant the Night Elf could be, but he was surprised when Illidan merely nodded. "Very well, mortal. But steel yourself," Illidan warned, an uncharacteristic hint of caution in his voice. "I was able to sense the entity controlling that undead, and they are far more powerful than I anticipated. There are few beings on Azeroth who could have survived as long as they did in a fight against me." Krivax nodded in understanding. That was about what he'd expected. While Illidan had fought on even ground with a fully embodied Lich King in the original timeline, that was after the Night Elf had empowered himself further with fell magic. That he would have difficulty fighting an undead possessed and empowered by Gul'dan wasn't a big surprise. Krivax could only hope that his contribution would be enough to tip the scales. As they fought their way into the deepest parts of the Violet Hold, Krivax did his best to conserve his strength for the battle ahead. Illidan held no such reservations, sending large arcs of green fire flying through the air with each swing of his twin blades, his fell-enhanced speed turning him into a swirling tempest of death that left nothing standing in his wake. Krivax could easily see why so many people had flocked to follow Illidan in the original timeline, and how the Night Elf had become instrumental in the Burning Legion's defeat. To be honest, Krivax had expected that they would find the Lich King in some large chamber where they would have their climactic fight. He'd always envisioned Gul'dan as that kind of cartoonishly evil villain, prone to theatrics and grandstanding monologues before engaging in battle. That was likely why he was utterly unprepared to be ambushed. It was likely only thanks to the layer of arcane shielding that he'd wrapped around his carapace the moment he entered the Violet Hold, along with his enchanted defensive gear, that he wasn't killed outright. Instead, the blow that impacted his chest as Gul'dan appeared from one of the shadow side passages only sent him flying into a nearby cell wall, making a large crack upon impact. "You stole my destiny," Gul'dan growled, his voice echoing with an otherworldly, abyssal tone as he launched a massive stream of dark magic toward Krivax. Krivax watched in horror as his silk golem, which he'd hastily unleashed from its container in an attempt to block the attack, immediately began to decay and unravel upon contacting the Lich King's magic. He'd only ever seen the thing be even slightly damaged by the most heavily enchanted of weapons and strongest attacks, but never as severely as this. "It is because of you that I was delivered to Kil'jaeden. It is because of you that I lost everything," Gul'dan shouted as he was forced to end the attack by Illidan, the Night Elf dashing forward and colliding with the Lich King. The resulting explosion of fell and death energies was enough to rock the prison, shattering many of the nearby walls. Despite this, the monk being possessed by Gul'dan never took his eyes away from Krivax as he blocked Illidan's ferocious strikes with an impossibly fast parry. "But it is no matter. I have acquired the power of a god, and I will use that power to destroy everyone who sought to deny me what was rightfully mine. Starting with you, that over-glorified lizard who killed me, and finally the Burning Legion itself." Illidan must not have liked Gul'dan ignoring him, because with a roar of primal fury he swung down at his opponent with both of his blades and unleashed a wave of fell magic that forced the Lich King back. The green flames seared into the possessed Pandren's form, causing visible burns across the undead's flesh. But the Lich King didn't falter. Instead he let loose an unearthly growl and sent forward several dark, necromantic tendrils toward the Night Elf that decayed everything they touched. Seeing that Gul'dan was fully occupied, Krivax stumbled up off the ground and used the last dredges of his life energy to heal his cracked carapace. Meanwhile, Illidan's few remaining sentinel guards were locked into combat with a pair of Gul'dan's death monks. It was fortunate that the majority of the undead monks had been either destroyed in the previous fighting or were preoccupied with the Kirin Tor, because Krivax doubted he would still be alive otherwise. It was likely only because the sentinels were among Tyronda's most skilled that they could hold their own against such a powerful foe. Once he had recovered, Krivax made a quick assessment of the battlefield and decided to focus on helping Illidan. The sentinels seemed like they would be able to last long enough on their own, and Illidan would need his help to take down the death monk being possessed by Gul'dan. The battle between Illidan and the Lich King had taken the two of them out of sight down a nearby hallway, so Krivax hurried to catch up. As he turned the corner, he was met with the sight of the two combatants locked in a struggle that few on Azeroth could even hope to participate in. Gul'dan's necromantic magic was eating away at the stone walls of the prison while the souls of the slain swirled around him and attacked his opponent. This would be enough to overwhelm most, but Illidan merely burned through these souls with contemptuous disregard and let loose a flurry of blows against Gul'dan. Krivax, knowing that he would be most useful supporting Illidan, focused on using his magic to distract the Lich King. Since the Violet Hold's wards prevented him from using geomancy on the stone floor, he instead summoned several water elementals and joined them in launching spears of ice toward Gul'dan whenever there was an opening. Even then, with the constant barrage of spells and powerful strikes from Illidan's blades, it was obvious that they were still at a disadvantage. Every attack barely seemed to faze Gul'dan's vessel, while the Lich King's retaliatory strikes forced both Krivax and Illidan on the defensive several times. Krivax thought that the tides had turned when the Sentinels unexpectedly managed to defeat their opponents and joined the fight with a volley of enchanted arrows. However, he quickly learned that individuals who lacked protection from the Lich King's overwhelming death magic, such as Krivax and Illidan's respective empowerments, could not tolerate Gul'dan's presence for very long. It only took a few minutes before the Sentinels began to convulse, their expressions twisted in pain as their life forces were sapped away by their mere proximity to the Lich King. Only due to Krivax's quick ability to sense and deduce what was happening, he managed to save their lives by ushering them away from the battlefield. As he rejoined Illidan in their struggle against the death monk possessed by Gul'dan, he began to truly fear what the Lich King could do in person. Such absurd and overwhelming power was enough to drive anyone to desperation. Gul'dan was beginning to show signs of being visibly weakened, but Krivax and Illidan were both in worse shape. After reaching the conclusion that the two of them would be unlikely to win a straightforward confrontation, Krivax began to consider other options. It took longer than he would have liked, but Krivax eventually recalled something about their current location and came up with a plan he thought might work. Needing Illidan's cooperation but not wanting Gul'dan to overhear his plan, Krivax took a moment to cast a spell that would open telepathic communication between him and Illidan. It had taken a while to learn the spell, but he was more grateful than ever that he'd decided to ask Vizier Hadix to teach it to him prior to their mission in Pandaria. Illidan, help me lure him to Archmage Kel'Thuzad's laboratory. I have a plan. Krivax projected his thoughts into the Night Elf's mind. Given how obsessed he is, Gul'dan will follow us. But we need to make it seem like we're running away. It took a moment for Illidan to respond, but eventually did with a subtle nod. With that, Krivax started to deliberately pull back, casting his spells defensively and making sure to move to Archmage Kel'Thuzad and Queen Kithix's shared laboratory. Illidan began to parry and dodge more than he attacked, feigning exhaustion as he retreated. Gul'dan immediately took the bait, releasing a triumphant roar as he attempted to ensnare them with dark tendrils. Running, are you? There's nowhere to hide. Having visited Archmage Kel'Thuzad and Queen Kithix several times for various reasons over the years, Krivax was easily able to lead them through the twisting halls toward the laboratory. When he arrived there, Krivax nearly let out a cheer of relief as he saw that the Archmage had left behind several prototype samples of the same anti-undead alchemical concoction that he'd made use of in Pandaria, exactly where he had last seen them. Wasting no time, Krivax telepathically shared the rest of his plan with Illidan moments before Gul'dan arrived. Though calling it a plan may have been a bit generous when Krivax simply used every dredge of power he had to freeze Gul'dan to the ground for a fraction of a second. With swift movements, Illidan picked up one of Kel'Thuzad's vials and hurled it at Gul'dan's frozen form. The moment the vial shattered, it was obvious that the elixir was having an effect on the Lich King, even if it was dramatically weaker than Krivax had wished. It was designed specifically to attack the necromantic magic that sustained the undead target, effectively stripping them of their will and removing them from the control of their master. However, the Lich King was the most powerful necromancer to ever walk Azeroth, and it would take more than a single vial to sever his control. Therefore, it was a good thing that Archmage Kel'Thuzad was the type of person who was rather obsessive in his research and had several shelves with various prototypes of the elixir. The next few minutes felt less like a heroic battle and more like a crude brawl as Krivax and Illidan did everything they could to keep Gul'dan in the laboratory while pelting him with glass bottles filled with bright liquids. It was clear that the Lich King was beginning to lose control over his vessel, each successive impact making the Death Monk less and less coordinated in their motions. Much to Krivax's relief, he soon began to see signs that the undead Pandaren was actually fighting against Gul'dan's control. The previous unwavering, dark glow the Pandaren monk's eyes began flickering intermittently with a hint of awareness and confusion. His initial plan had been to simply weaken Gul'dan as much as possible, but his vessel turned out to be far stronger-willed than expected. Eventually, with one final vial shattered against his form, Gul'dan let out a furious bellow as the necromantic magic surrounding the possessed monk receded dramatically. "Don't you dare consider this victory!" Gul'dan shouted, his hate-filled eyes locked directly onto Krivax. "I'm coming for you and this city. And when I do, no amount of trickery will save you." Uninterested in Gul'dan's overdramatic threats, Krivax said nothing as he watched the undead monk suddenly collapse forward, the Lich King's control over them severed entirely. Illidan approached the undead with his twin blades poised to strike, but Krivax tiredly held out a hand to stop him. "Wait. He's no longer being controlled. Killing him now would be senseless." Unsurprisingly, Illidan looked up at him like he was crazy, as the people of Azeroth generally didn't tolerate undead in any form. However, Krivax's perspective was a bit different since he recalled the undead who had managed to break free of the Lich King in the original timeline and fight against their former master. After several tense moments, Illidan nodded and lowered his blades. "Very well. I will stay my hand for now, but you owe me an explanation. Both for this, and for the nonsense that the Lich King was spouting throughout our fight." Krivax couldn't help but wince, not looking forward to that conversation. It shouldn't be too much of an issue, since Tyrande was already aware that he was a seer and should be able to keep Illidan in line, but it still wasn't a topic he liked talking about. Not seeing any way to avoid a future explanation, Krivax nodded in agreement before turning his attention to the undead monk. "Hello. I'm Vizier Krivax, leader of the Alliance Defense Force. Who are you?" The undead monk was quick to respond with an urgent tone, but Krivax suddenly remembered that he hadn't learned the Pandaren language. Turning a sheepish gaze to Illidan, the night elf scoffed before casting a translation spell over the both of them. Krivax wished that he knew how to do that, but translation spells were surprisingly complex and his time wasn't unlimited. "Let's try that again," Krivax said as he turned his attention back to the newly freed undead. "My apologies. Can you tell me your name?" The undead Pandaren didn't lose any of his urgency as he responded, this time in what sounded to him like Nerubian. "My name is Shangzai, and you must evacuate this city immediately." "Oh, don't worry. The city isn't in any danger," said Krivax, feeling relieved to learn that the undead was actually friendly. "The portal hub isn't in any danger, and I can sense several of the Alliance's strongest mages have already returned to Dalaran." Krivax wasn't lying. The Council of Six had teleported back to the city sometime during their fight with Gul'dan and converged on the Violet Citadel. Not long before their arrival, the demonic presence had disappeared, most likely teleporting away rather than fighting multiple angry archmages. He could feel that the Dreadlord had succeeded in doing something to Dalaran's wards, but he doubted it mattered. Even if the anti-spatial magic wards had been harmed beyond repair, the portal hub was fine, so the Alliance would be able to reinforce the city even if the Scourge started teleporting in undead. Though, it was a bit strange that the Council of Six was still here and hadn't returned to help defend Kultiras. Krivax explained all of this to Shangzai, who shook his head in frustration. "You don't understand. Tichondrius is not one to rely on any singular plan," Shangzai urgently explained. He knew that there was a chance Gul'dan would fail due to his obsession, so he devised an alternative plan to destroy the Violet Citadel's tallest spire if the portal hub was not disrupted. Krivax felt his heart drop as he understood what the undead was implying. It wasn't something that many people knew, but the tallest spire of the Violet Citadel was actually a powerful anti-siege weapon capable of channeling the city's leyline nexus. All of the Alliance's plans to defend Dalaran assumed the full operation of the spire, which was why they felt comfortable leaving the city relatively undefended. Krivax immediately ran out of the laboratory and began making his way out the Violet Hold, leaving a startled Illidan to follow. Once he exited the prison, it became clear that Shangzai had been telling the truth as he saw the reason why the Council of Six had yet to leave the city. The tallest spire of the Violet Citadel, once looming high over the city as a testament to Dalaran's might, had been completely destroyed. the rubbles of its remains laid in the streets in front of the fortress, with fell green smoke rising from the center of the impact. "Thank the sun well that you're here, Vizier Krivax." Krivax pulled his gaze from the horrible sight to Magister Romarth, who looked uncharacteristically exhausted as he ran toward his side. "Magister, what happened?" Krivax urgently, though he already felt like he knew. "We don't know. The citadel simply exploded after you entered the Violet Hold," Romarth said grimly after taking a deep breath to steady himself. "But that's not why I was looking for you. A few moments ago, I received a report that the Scourge was seen leaving Kultiras and began moving toward the coastline of Silverpine Forest. The Council of Six believes that they intend to attack Dalaran and has ordered an evacuation." His worst fears confirmed, Krivax immediately began making his way to the ADF headquarters, so he could do everything he could to help evacuate, and then hopefully defend the city. The threat from Gul'dan, which he previously hadn't paid much mind to, now seemed much more immediately threatening. Everything that the Lich King had said and done during their confrontation, from his hate-filled words to his focus on killing Krivax, made it obvious that Gul'dan was indeed coming for him. Across Laudermere Lake, he could see every day a city that had suffered potentially irrecoverable harm as a result of his decisions, and now the Lich King intended to deliver an even worse fate to Dalaran. Krivax had every intention of doing whatever was necessary to prevent that from happening. Oh, Dalaran might be vulnerable with the Violet Citadel damaged, the Alliance Navy likely lagging behind in the Kultiran harbor, and the aspects all unavailable, but hope was not lost. Since he'd successfully defended the portal hub, the most powerful members of the Alliance would be free to arrive in Dalaran far before Gul'dan. Not only that, but Krivax had been doing what he could to prepare Azeroth for the Lich King from the moment he hatched from his egg. This was what Krivax had been working toward for his entire second life, and if Gul'dan thought that destroying Dalaran was going to be easy, then the arrogant bastard had another thing coming. "I need to contact the High King," Krivax thought, his mind racing. "I think this is an appropriate time for Azrael Nerub to reveal Project Sanctum." Tichondrius did not approve of the Scourge launching an attack on Dalaran. It was only thanks to his own cunning that all signs now pointed to the attack being a success that would cripple one of the most important cities in the Alliance. Had matters been left solely to that fool Gul'dan, then the Scourge would have broken itself uselessly assaulting one of the most fortified locations in the Eastern Kingdoms for little strategic benefit. It was Tichondrius who had formed the strategy to pin the Alliance naval forces to Kultiras, while using saboteurs to weaken Dalaran. It was Tichondrius who had actually succeeded in that sabotage, while Gul'dan predictably lost sight of his objective in favor of focusing entirely on killing a single mortal. It was Tichondrius who had made every single plan that was necessary to ensure Gul'dan's incompetence was mitigated as much as possible. Naturally, his efforts were why the Scourge was currently in a superior strategic position compared to the Alliance. This was in spite of the unexpected speed with which the defenders of Azeroth had managed to pierce the veil surrounding Pandaria and begin a surprise assault on the Scourge's forces. Still, Tichondrius did not approve of this assault and would have chosen another path if not for the Lich King's intransigence. "Damn those fools and their obsession with power," Tichondrius cursed hatefully as he beat his wings and studied the enemy preparations from afar. Kil'jaeden should have never allowed the Theroch to share what he discovered with Gul'dan. It has made him far too difficult to control. A complex invisibility spell more sophisticated than any the mortals of this world were familiar with had allowed him to fly away from the Council of Six while they dealt with the wake of destruction he'd left behind. Now, Tichondrius was maintaining position a decent distance away from Dalaran, exploiting his magically enhanced sight to monitor a city which had completely shielded itself from all scrying attempts. "I see little reason for you to be so concerned, Tichondrius," said Varimathras, who was flying by his side and looking down on the mortal city with disdain. "Even if the Alliance transfers their most powerful defenders to Dalaran via portal, they clearly lack the means to hold off the Scourge offensive. The Lich King has grown in power faster than expected. Without the aspects, these mortals have few means of defeating him," said Balnazar, unsurprisingly quick to agree with his brother. His hatred has made him strong and focused, as predicted. Tichondrius was silent for a moment as he watched a group of mortal mages use geomancy to erect obstacles along the only waterway connecting Lordaeron Lake to the ocean. Nerubian viziers, Kirin Tor mages, and Kuldoi magisters all worked in concert to do what they could to delay the scourge advance as much as possible. Such paltry efforts would not deter a creature as massive as Shenzin Su for long, but it was emblematic of the problem he felt like only he could see. The nations of Azeroth have grown far more interconnected and cooperative than we accounted for, said Tichondrius, glaring at the mortals as his mind raced. We should have made more efforts to weaken and fracture the alliance before confronting them. It would have made it much easier to predict their capabilities and ultimately destroy them. That we have been forced into this confrontation so early by that meddlesome seer and Gul'dan's impulsivity is a mistake that threatens to cost us dearly. Tichondrius had been quite surprised when he'd been informed of Dtheorok's death at the hands of Illidan, but even more so when Dtheorok reformed in the Twisting Nether and shared what he discovered. Apparently, one of the Nerubians had somehow known far more than he should have about the Burning Legion and was responsible for warning the Dragonflights of Gul'dan's plan to raise the tomb of Sargeras, resulting in the Warlock's death. This was something that not even the Burning Legion had known about, and pointed to the likelihood of the Nerubian being some manner of seer. Of course, Gul'dan would have failed in his pathetic ambitions and been torn apart by the demons within the tomb even if he successfully raised it, but Tichondrius had not bothered to inform Gul'dan of his likely fate. Instead, Gul'dan blamed this Krivax for sharing his prophetic knowledge and denying him of his rightful destiny to become a god. It was a laughable notion, but the hatred and focus Gul'dan developed after this revelation was useful in furthering the Burning Legion's machinations, at least in the opinion of Kil'jaeden. The Lich King had grown significantly in strength due to these events, his abilities growing more potent in general, and he had also learned how to possess and empower his undead servants without leaving his frozen prison. Tichondrius had reminded Kil'jaeden several times that this would make Gul'dan more difficult to control, but he simply didn't care. So long as the Lich King served his purpose as a weapon meant to lay waste to Azeroth, little else mattered from Kil'jaeden's perspective. Personally, Tichondrius speculated that Kil'jaeden's normally cunning mind was compromised by his obsession to deny the Draenei any homeland which they could rebuild on, but he would never dare voice such a thought aloud. You would do well not to underestimate our enemy, lest you suffer the same fate as Dtheorok and Mal'Ganis, Tichondrius warned as he directed his attention back to Dalaran. The city was a flurry of frantic activity as the mortal civilians were rapidly being evacuated via the portal hub. Tichondrius watched as the mortal who had caused so much trouble, Krivax, helped organize the city's evacuation as well as directed the Nerubians from the local enclave. Meanwhile, the Council of Six and the Kirin Tor were busy establishing layer after layer of arcane barriers around their forces. A wide variety of mortal siege weapons were being placed strategically around the city's perimeter, everything from trebuchets and enchanted high elven ballistas to the primitive gunpowder cannons and mortars of Ironforge. A decent number of aerial forces were gathered as well, which was expected given that they could relocate from Kultiras to Dalaran far quicker than Shenzin Su. It was a good defense given the limited amount of time that the Alliance had to prepare, but it wouldn't be enough. Even now, Tichondrius could feel the fabric of reality growing dangerously fragile due to the sheer number of portals being opened by the Alliance. Simultaneously evacuating the city's non-combatants and reinforcing it with additional ground troops was straining the limits of the Alliance's logistical capabilities. Even you can't deny that Gul'dan's hatred has helped him to become more powerful than we could have imagined, said Varimathras, not sharing his concern. No amount of luck or preparation can withstand the overwhelming force he can bring to bear after augmenting that overgrown turtle. Tichondrius scowled as he was once again reminded of how short-sighted otherwise intelligent creatures could become under the influence of fell magic. Still, he couldn't deny that Varimathras had a point. Looking behind him, Tichondrius bore witness to a sight that would be considered impressive on even the most advanced of worlds that the Burning Legion had conquered. Surrounded by a veritable flood of undead that blanketed the landscape, the gargantuan form of Shenzhen Su was shrouded in a perpetual blizzard and surrounded by the shrieking souls of the Lich King's victims as it made its way down an icy path toward Dalaran. The Avras River, which connected Lordamere Lake to Azeroth's ocean, had burst its banks because of the large ocean waves created by the gargantuan turtle's mass and been entirely turned to ice by Gul'dan. Given that Shenzhen Su was too large to fit within even the largest of rivers, freezing the water on the ground allowed for a mostly frictionless path cleared of obstructions. The normally waterbound creature had been able to traverse almost all the way to the lake while also preventing the Alliance Navy from harassing their rear. It was truly an impressive sight. Even if this course of events wasn't the most tactically sound. The lack of a maritime route to Dalaran capable of holding Shenzhen Su's size combined with the creature's immense mass and its ineptness when traveling across land meant that the Scourge's attack would be significantly delayed. The added travel time moving between the coast of Silverpine Forest and Lordaeron Lake had given the enemy many extra hours to prepare when they very easily could have already attacked several more convenient targets instead. The only benefit to this ridiculous course of action was that the mortals had not expected or prepared for it either. Without the Violet Citadel, Dalaran lacked any form of defensive infrastructure to protect it from this unexpected avenue of attack. "I suppose we'll learn soon just how wise it was to indulge Gul'dan's folly," said Tichondrius, knowing that there was little point in further debating the matter. Glancing back to see Shenzhen Su finally entering Lordamere Lake with a great splash of displaced water, he knew that it was time for the Scourge to begin their assault. "Varimathras, you're assigned to lead our aerial forces and prevent the enemy from exploiting their greater strength in that arena. Balnazar, you will take a group of Kuldir and launch an attack on Capital City, forcing the Alliance to split their focus." Tichondrius didn't trust Gul'dan not to somehow ruin an assault that should otherwise be a straightforward victory, so he would ensure they won this battle by any means necessary. "I see little need for this when these mortals will all soon join the Scourge, but very well," Varimathras said with a dismissive gesture as he looked toward a barely perceptible group of Alliance aerial fighters approaching the Scourge's flank. "I suppose that while we're busy fighting on the front lines you'll be moving throughout the battlefield and orchestrating everything as always?" "Obviously," said Tichondrius, disappearing in a swirl of shadows from the skies and reappearing in the Scourge's headquarters on Shenzhen Su. Varimathras and Balnazar were far inferior to him in terms of strategic insight and cunning, a fact of reality which often caused them to resent his leadership. As he appeared in the headquarters, a room atop the former Temple of Five Elements that was now filled with maps, scrying mirrors, and some of the most intelligent members of the Scourge, he was greeted with a litany of reports detailing the current state of their forces. They had suffered minimal losses during their battle at Kultiras due to their mostly defensive posture, but that wasn't to say they had suffered none at all. The Burning Legion had evaluated Azeroth as a world of relatively primitive technology that relied heavily on the abnormal magical strength of its inhabitants, and concluded that it would most easily be conquered through sowing division and discord. However, circumstances had been moving in exactly the wrong direction as the creation of the Alliance fostered cooperation among its member nations and the Keeper Arkida's shared Titan technology with Nerubian. Naturally, this dissemination of technology was fairly slow due to the inability of the mortals to fully comprehend its complexity and the obvious chaos that would come from too rapidly spreading such advancements. These factors, combined with the enemy's surprisingly capable aerial forces, had resulted in the Scourge losing a few important assets during the initial moments of their attack. After he finished reading the reports, Tichondrius took a few moments to consider the best path forward. "Tell the Kuldir to summon their mist to blanket our approach," Tichondrius absently said to one of the nearby undead after he'd reached a decision, certain his orders would be followed. Ignoring the undead being as they began to relay his orders through a series of scrying mirrors, Tichondrius reopened his telepathic connection to the Lich King. "Position Shenzhen Su close enough to Dalaran that the siege weapons on its back are within range to launch the plague containers," Tichondrius commanded, his tone brokering no argument. "But do not draw too close to the city until the Alliance has revealed what they have prepared." While Shen Su was undoubtedly the Scourge's most powerful asset, it was also one of its greatest vulnerabilities. The creature was completely incapable of protecting itself from any enemy forces that managed to land on its shell, and any serious injury could prove catastrophic to the Scourge's ambitions. The only reason that the Lich King had not been killed shortly after his arrival on Azeroth was due to the mobility provided to him by Shen Su. Should the creature be rendered immobile or seriously harmed, the defenders of Azeroth would almost certainly launch an all-out assault to exploit that vulnerability and end the Lich King permanently. Tichondrius had no intention of allowing this to happen, and would compel Shen Su and the Lich King to retreat the very moment it became clear that the Alliance held a significant advantage. Gul'dan's response to his orders was as predictably furious as always, though this time it also carried a trace of disdain that had Tichondrius wishing the orc still had flesh so he could savor tearing it apart. "I had not taken you for a coward, demon. My forces are more than capable of shattering their defenses, yet you expect me to stay back like a cowering child?" Gul'dan had become increasingly defiant recently and would almost certainly attempt to betray the Burning Legion soon. Fortunately, even a creature as dull-minded as Gul'dan realized how much he was relying on the cunning of Tichondrius and his fellow Nathrazim. Without their plans, the Aspects would have already found the Lich King and destroyed him with little effort. "I expect you to do as you're told, Gul'dan," Tichondrius immediately responded, "unless you've grown arrogant enough to believe yourself capable of defeating the Alliance while also withstanding the Burning Legion's wrath." Tichondrius could also tell that the tortures Gul'dan suffered under Kil'jaeden's hand still lingered and caused the Lich King to wisely consider the potential consequences of betrayal. Even with the Lich King's impressive strength, there were many ways that the Burning Legion could punish him should he choose to go against them. Sure enough, it only took a moment for Gul'dan to do the sensible thing and fall back in line, albeit grudgingly. "Fine. So long as we turn Dalaran to rubble, and I'm given the chance to peel apart that loathsome Nerubian soul, I will tolerate your needless caution. For now." Tichondrius scoffed at the Lich King's worthless posturing and immediately cut the telepathic link, satisfied that his commands would be followed, and turned his attention to the scrying mirrors to watch the battlefield. It wasn't long before the Kuldir received his orders, and the sound of a loud horn could be heard blowing across Lordamere Lake. The horn's sound, deep and foreboding, marked the beginning of the Kuldir's attack and the Scourge's assault on Dalaran. An eerie mist rolled across the waters of Lordamere Lake, obscuring the view of the Alliance as a few dozen Kuldir longboats began making their way to Capital City with Balnazar openly flying above them. Tichondrius paid little heed to the diversionary attack, trusting that Balnazar was capable enough to at least handle this, and instead focused entirely on the assault on Dalaran. Under the cover of mists, Shen Su continued its slow, inexorable advance toward the city as the Alliance sent its aerial forces to intercept them, likely with the goal of seizing control of the skies over Lordamere Lake. Although the dragonflights were all occupied elsewhere, there were still several individual dragons participating in Dalaran's defense, such as Archmage Crossus and several others too unimportant for Tichondrius to have gathered information about them. These dragons led the charge of the Alliance's aerial forces and were followed by large numbers of Griffin and Dragonhawk riders, as well as flying Nerubians and some mechanical flying devices. Archmage Crossus was competent enough with magic that he could dispel significant areas of the Kuldir mist with little issue, rendering them vulnerable to attack. Tichondrius knew from experience that the combination of dragonfire, alchemical explosives, and magical attacks that they threatened to unleash would obliterate the Kuldir longboats if left uncontested. This was why he had not only specifically assigned Varimathras to lead the aerial defense, but also to prepare a strategic countermeasure, knowing that this would be the beginning of the battle for Dalaran and that their ambush would be far more deadly with 2 Nathrazim compared to 1. Tichondrius teleported by Varimathras' side under the cover of an invisibility spell. "Wait for me to give the order before you move," Tichondrius ordered after establishing a telepathic connection to Varimathras, just in case the enemy forces included someone with abnormally sharp hearing. Tichondrius sensed a combination of acknowledgement and bloodthirsty anticipation through the connection. Turning his attention back to the Alliance's approach, Tichondrius observed them closely and waited until they were nearly directly above the line of Chaldea longboats before giving his fellow Nathrazim the signal. Instantly, Varimathras fell upon the Alliance aerial forces like a dark meteor, fellfire-wreathed claws tearing through a gnomish aircraft with little effort as his invisibility spell faded. Meanwhile, Tichondrius unleashed a wave of fellfire down on the mortals that burned through their flesh, preferring to stay at a higher vantage point to observe the battlefield more effectively. The sudden and fierce onslaught from two Nathrazim caused pandemonium among the Alliance, which the Scourge was quick to exploit. Several dozen undead cloud serpents emerged from the mists while a group of Naga sea witches used their magic to send multiple streams of water surging toward the Alliance. Unfortunately, the enemy was not as unprepared as Tichondrius had hoped, and Archmage Crossus specifically showed himself to be a formidable opponent. Demon vermin. Crossus shouted as he used his mastery of magic to freeze solid the water that threatened to engulf the Alliance forces while also moving to intercept Varimathras with a furious roar. "Kulkos, you handle the other." At his call, Tichondrius found himself being attacked by an unexpectedly young blue dragon, who was most likely Kulkos. While he had no doubt that his vastly superior experience would allow him to slay the whelp eventually, a few bouts of exchanged spells was enough to make clear that doing so would take more time than he wished to invest. He had already succeeded in his goal, assisting Varimathras in turning the skies above Laudermere Lake into a frenzy of combat as the Scourge and the Alliance clashed in a massive aerial battle. "I'll search for your corpse when this battle is over, dragon. You'll make for an excellent servant," Tichondrius promised as he teleported back to Shenzhen Su and turned his attention back to the scrying mirrors. This was how he preferred to wage war, leveraging his superior magical abilities to tip the scales in key battles before retreating to a safe location where he could analyze and plan further. However, the analysis of this particular battle was less favorable than it seemed on the surface. Tichondrius scowled as he watched the battle for several moments and concluded that the Alliance forces were superior in this arena. The Nerubian flyers proved themselves to be a particular annoyance, descending upon the Scourge in great numbers without the normal hesitation shown by most mortals. While each of them individually were easily dispatched, the Nerubians quickly swarmed any member of the Scourge who threatened to gain an advantage against them, effectively neutralizing the threat. A few of those flyers also seemed to carry explosives that allowed them to attack targets substantially larger than them and cause immense damage. It was only due to the Naga spellcasters lurking beneath the waters that the Scourge was able to protect the Chaldea as they approached Dalaran's shores. Not for the first time, Tichondrius cursed how much more difficult his plans had become thanks to Azrael Nerub's inclusion in the Alliance. The Burning Legion had wrongly believed that the Nerubians were too different and isolationist from the other races of Azeroth to work with them. Tichondrius couldn't help but wonder how much responsibility for their misconception could be laid at the feet of the same Nerubian who had arranged for Gul'dan's death. "I suppose I'll find out soon enough," Tichondrius thought with dark promise. Tichondrius' thoughts were interrupted by one of the undead Pandaren monks in the command center monitoring the undead on the gargantuan turtle. "Lord Tichondrius, our siege weapons are within range of the enemy city and ready to fire on your order." "Then fire immediately," Tichondrius said without hesitation, not bothering to look away from the scrying mirrors. "Let's see just how well they can withstand our plague." Tichondrius observed with a detached interest as massive plague containers were launched from the back of Shenzhen Su by the Scourge's trebuchets. Although the siege weapons themselves were primitive, the plague itself was one of the worst magical concoctions that Tichondrius had encountered in his many millennia of conquering worlds. The Alliance had a significant amount of time to react to the containers as they emerged from the mist and slowly arced toward their positions. This meant a large number of them were intercepted by a dazzling display of well-aimed spells from the Kirin Tor, causing them to explode in a thunderous boom well before reaching their target. However, there were simply too many of them, and a dark cloud of pestilence eventually began to settle around Dalaran's outer defenses. Tichondrius watched with grim satisfaction as he saw several mortals around the very edges of their defensive formation begin to succumb to the effects, their bodies collapsing in grotesque, twisted forms. It was a delightful sight, and a fate he hoped to deliver to the entirety of Dalaran. Sadly, those hopes were soon dashed as the Alliance quickly deployed their light-wielding forces to counteract the plague. There were far more than Tichondrius had expected. Previous scouting report had indicated that most of the paladins of the Silver Hand had already been deployed to other locations. The only explanation was that Azrael Nerub must have sent their so-called guardians of Nerub to help guard the city. Cursing under his breath, Tichondrius was beginning to truly hate those meddlesome creatures. He had been counting on the plague to weaken the enemy's defenses and leave them disorganized, and knew that the Scourge would be far more vulnerable to the Alliance's own siege weapons without it. "Your plan is failing, demon," Gul'dan snarled through their telepathic link. "If you expected our enemy to simply die obediently with our first strike, then you're even more of a fool than I expected," Tichondrius responded derisively as he studied the battlefield before deciding on a plan. "Send all of our ground forces to join the Chaldea. Overwhelm them, and focus on opening a path into the city." It was an inelegant plan, but one that he felt held the highest chance for success. Anything more complicated would risk Gul'dan ruining it, and this would allow the Scourge to leverage its greatest strengths. For once, Gul'dan didn't bother to argue with him. When the Scourge's forces stepped onto Dalaran's coast, where the Chaldea's mist could not reach due to the Kirin Tor's wards, his prediction was quickly proven true. Chaldea, sea giants, and Naga alike were cut down by a combination of spells and more mundane projectiles coming from Dalaran's walls. Everything from cannon fire, absurdly effective alchemical weapons, or massive balls of fire thrown by an archmage rained down on the Scourge as they approached the city. It was a fairly impressive sight, but one that the Scourge would inevitably overcome by relying on its most powerful asset. The Alliance's attacks were simply not enough to overcome the innate resiliency of the undead and the sheer numbers the Scourge possessed. Injuries meant nothing to the undead, and they continued to charge relentlessly against Dalaran's walls, threatening to overwhelm the Alliance despite their valiant efforts. The heavily enchanted walls surrounding the city and the powerful magical wards of the Kirin Tor caused the Scourge to suffer significant losses, but there was inevitably a breaking point. Seeing a potential opportunity, Tichondrius once again teleported to the battlefield right above a particular section of Dalaran's walls, intending to tip the scales in the Scourge's favor. The light being wielded by the Alliance's forces made Tichondrius wince in pain and prevented him from casting an invisibility spell, but it didn't matter. "Dreadlord! Kill it, quick!" Tichondrius ignored the shouts of the mortals and opened several small portals to the twisting nether along the wall's ramparts. Several feelhounds immediately poured through the portals, jumping on mages and tearing out their throats. The feelhounds, with the affinity for consuming magic, quickly began to wreak havoc as they tore through arcane barriers and disrupted the focus of spellcasters. "Now, Gul'dan," Tichondrius commanded as he unleashed a stream of fellfire on a light-wielding Nerubian who attempted to save one of the mages. Responding to his orders, the Lich King used his ability to empower his undead to great effect on one of the sea giants, allowing it to destroy a section of the wall with a thunderous crash. The breach served as a beacon to the undead horde, causing them to surge into the city through the gap in the wall with renewed vigor into Dalaran's streets. Satisfied with his contribution, Tichondrius recast his invisibility spells and flew high into the skies so that he could watch the scene below. The battle would be too chaotic to monitor by scrying mirror from this point forward, so there was little sense in returning to the command center on the central pagoda on Shenzhen Su. As Tichondrius surveyed the battlefield over the next several minutes, he very quickly realized that the Alliance was far from defeated. While the mortals had lost the advantage of their walls, they had obviously relocated their most powerful members to help defend Dalaran and were well prepared to face the Scourge head-on. This became exceedingly clear as Tichondrius watched a 20-foot-tall Nerubian spiderlord glowing brightly with the light clear an entire street of undead by trampling over them and swinging his scythe-like arms in wide arcs. Meanwhile, The Council of Six and the elite members of the Kirin Tor unleashed devastating magical assaults, their spells weaving through the Scourge with deadly precision. Tichondrius would normally have trusted the Scourge's relentless assault, the raising of each freshly made corpse and constant attrition to eventually exhaust the Alliance, but he wasn't sure that would happen in this case. Not only due to the Alliance's extensive usage of the light, but also because the focus of Gul'dan Ire, Krivax, was reinvigorating and healing wide swaths of mortals with life-infused flames. The sight was enough to convince Tichondrius that Krivax needed to be dealt with if the Scourge wished to make progress. Besides, the mortal had caused him far too many problems already, and Tichondrius eagerly looked forward to ending that threat permanently. The Lich King should have little problem capturing the soon-to-be-dead Nerubian's soul given his proximity to Dalaran, so there was no need to capture them alive. Gul'dan, send your most powerful undead to my location, Tichondrius commanded, deciding to handle the matter himself as he flew closer to his target. Also, focus your efforts on destroying another section of the wall. We can't allow our forces to become stuck in a narrow point of entry if we wish to maintain the momentum of the assault. Surprisingly, Gul'dan was silent for abnormally long before responding, his voice carrying a mixture of malice and an uncharacteristic solemnity that made Tichondrius pause. This plan of yours better work, demon. Should you fail to kill that mortal and deliver me his soul, then you will have proved your ineptitude, and I will no longer have any reason to tolerate your presence. Tichondrius could tell Gul'dan meant every word of his threat and would doubtlessly attempt to fulfill it if given the opportunity. He and his fellow Nathrazim had established plenty of countermeasures for that potential outcome, but those countermeasures would do nothing but hurt their cause if it came to that. Just do as you're told, Gul'dan. I will succeed where you failed, Tichondrius responded with forced calm. A tense silence lingered between them for several moments before Gul'dan suddenly closed the telepathic connection and set off to do as he was instructed. Refocusing on the matter at hand, Tichondrius turned his attention back to his target as he began planning the best way to kill him. Tichondrius was confident in his ability to slay the Nerubian on his own, but the mortal was currently nestled safely to the rear of the Alliance forces. Even he would find himself overwhelmed should he act so recklessly, especially with so many formidable individuals nearby capable of intervening at a moment's notice. Not to mention the fact that Gul'dan had already revealed his interest in Krivax to the Nerubian, and the Alliance was well aware of how important he was. In their place, Tichondrius would have prepared several traps around such a high-value target, and he had no doubt that the Alliance had done the same. This was why he had ordered Gul'dan to send his most powerful undead and had not wanted the orc to participate directly by possessing an undead. The Alliance needed to be thoroughly distracted so that Krivax could be killed in a single, swift motion. Still hidden under the cover of his invisibility spells, Tichondrius landed on the roof of a building on the same street as Krivax, watching the mortal warily for any reaction. He knew from his experience during the War of the Ancients fighting against Alexstrasza that the mortal likely possessed extraordinary sensory abilities. This was almost certainly why their sabotage had been only partially successful, but the sheer volume of magic being expended on the battlefield should cover his approach. Not seeing any immediate reaction from the Nerubian, Tichondrius saw this as a sign to proceed and silently walked over to the two members of the Kirin Tor stationed on the roof and launching spells at undead below. With practiced ease, Tichondrius wove an illusion over them at the same moment that he buried his claws within the chest of one of the mortals and casually launched a sphere of fellfire at the other, killing them both in seconds. Anyone outside of the illusion would neither hear nor see anything suspicious. Continuing his plan, Tichondrius began to weave stronger and stronger concealment spells over the rooftop, knowing he could not risk being discovered if he wanted his assassination to be successful. Once he was done, Tichondrius looked back toward the battlefield and saw that Gul'dan had done as he'd commanded and sent dozens of undead monks to put pressure on this location. None of them were as powerful as Shangzai, who Gul'dan had lost needlessly with his incompetence, but they were all formidable in their own right. Their presence resulted in the Alliance spreading their forces even thinner, creating the opening that he needed. Even for a Nathrazim as powerful as Tichondrius, It typically wasn't easy to open portals to the twisting nether capable of summoning any demons of note, especially on Azeroth. However, the Alliance had made things slightly easier for him through their frantic use of portal magic to reinforce their city. Never one to miss an opportunity, Tichondrius exploited the weakness in the local fabric of reality. With a series of complex incantations, he tore several rifts to the twisting nether around his location, allowing demonic reinforcements to spill through into the city. The most powerful of which were naturally around his target. Krivax, be careful. The warning shout came from one of the strange winged Nerubians as a group of Tichondrius' personal elite Felguards charged toward the mortal from a nearby portal. Each of the hulking demons were veterans of countless conquests, and used their massive axes to maim and dismember Krivax's guards with brutal efficiency. Tichondrius grinned with content as he saw that most of them died far too quickly for the mortal to use his healing flames. Unfortunately, his assumption that the mortal would have more protection than was readily apparent proved to be correct. One of the guards around Krivax quickly transformed, revealing themselves to be a titanic watcher as they descended on the Felguards with overwhelming force. Another, a Nerubian vizier who had been fighting by Krivax's side, showed themselves to be an exceptionally skilled spellcaster as they sank the ground beneath the Felguard's feet. Rat, search our surroundings. Find the demon creating these portals. I'm trying, Vizier Hadix. But there's too much interference, Krivax called out as he desperately healed the few mortals who had survived the initial assault. Masruk. Go find Fordring. We need his help. Not wanting his enemies to successfully contact reinforcements, Tichondrius immediately opened another rift above the winged Nerubian as they took flight, sending several infernals crashing toward them. However, they managed to dodge the burning constructs in an act of surprising agility and continued flying north. Scowling, Tichondrius focused his efforts on killing Krivax before any reinforcements could arrive. This proved to be infuriatingly difficult as the Nerubian seemingly realized that he was being targeted and began fighting more defensively. The empowerment given by Alexstrasza was perfect for such a tactic, granting the Nerubian extreme endurance and allowing him to heal his allies. Not to mention the growing number of unusually skilled mortals who seemingly flocked to protect him. Thoroughly enraged as wave after wave of demons failed to kill a single mortal, Tichondrius couldn't help but summon an illusion of himself within view of the Nerubian on top of the opposite rooftop. Why won't you simply die? Tichondrius asked through his illusion as he ignored the volley of projectiles that passed through it in response. This city's fate is sealed. You've resisted for longer than expected, but even this is only a fraction of the number of undead to descend upon Dalaran. More and more of your allies join the scourge with every moment. This is not a battle that you can win. While Tichondrius' words were meant to break his enemy's resolve, they were not necessarily a lie. Gul'dan had destroyed another section of Dalaran's walls nearly 10 minutes ago and allowed another vector for the scourge to enter the city. The Alliance had many powerful individuals within its ranks, but they would not last forever against such sheer numbers. Even now, large portions of the city had been completely overrun by the undead and emptied of all life. It wouldn't be long before the rest followed. And I thought the Lich King was arrogant. Aren't you supposed to be the smart one? Krivax taunted back even as he continued to fight the waves of demons and undead alongside his allies. Tichondrius' illusion scowled down at the Nerubian with open disdain. I am the most intelligent of my kind. Which is why I know your fight is futile. Surrender now, and your death will be painless. That was a partial lie, of course. He would indeed make the mortal's death painless, but his undeath would be excruciating. Gul'dan had made it quite clear that he intended to make sure of it. Predictably, the ungrateful mortal spat on his mercy as he replied, You might be smart, but your hubris means that you never considered that we would have prepared for you, demon. The one that should surrender is you. There was a confidence in Krivax's words that momentarily caused Tichondrius to hesitate, but he quickly brushed it off. He was certain by now that the Nerubian was just bluffing, and it would be safe to end this farce by slaying the mortal directly. However, just as he had resolved to do so, Tichondrius suddenly sensed an enormous spike of arcane magic emanating from Laudermere Lake. Almost immediately afterwards, there was a blinding flash of violet light which momentarily forced him to look away. Once it dissipated, Tichondrius was greeted to a sight that caused him to freeze completely in shock. High above Shenzhen Su was a massive structure that looked frightening, similar to the flying necropoli of Maldraxxus. Shaped loosely like a pyramid, its sides were completely covered in webs that were themselves covered in thousands of Nerubians skittering across it. Any undead who attempted to fly close to the structure were immediately shot out of the sky through a combination of magic and projectile weaponry being fired from every possible angle. It was a feat of magical engineering that was within the means of the Burning Legion, but should be impossible for a world as primitive as Azeroth. Even teleporting the structure from Northrend to the Eastern Kingdoms should have been beyond the Alliance's capabilities with Malygos trapped on Pandaria. That was unless they had the assistance of some other incredibly powerful spellcaster who the Scourge was unaware of. Tichondrius was pulled from his shock as he realized he could see some small objects falling from the flying necropolis and quickly cast a spell to enhance his vision. The next moment, he almost wished that he hadn't, as he saw that those objects were in fact heavily armed mortals descending on Shenzhen Su's back with magic to slow their falls. The vast majority were Nerubians, but there were also many heavily armored Draenei as well. Tichondrius knew that the Draenei had settled on the same continent as Azrael Nerub, so it would make sense for the damned Nerubians to invite them to the assault. When he spotted Prophet Velen himself among the descending figures, shining so brightly with the light that the perpetual blizzard roaring around Shenzhen Su parted in his wake, Tichondrius knew that the Scourge was in trouble. Gul'dan, submerge Shenzhen Su beneath the waters. Now! Tichondrius commanded urgently. The Lich King understood the danger he was in and immediately followed his orders without complaint. As Tichondrius watched the turtle slowly descend into the murky depths of Laudermere Lake, he nearly let out a breath of relief until the situation suddenly changed. The very earth shook and rose beneath the enormous turtle, forcing it to rise back up in an astonishing display of earth manipulation. Tracing the magic back to its source, Tichondrius spotted a dwarf with what looked like metallic skin among those descending from the necropolis. Unless the aspects had passed on Deathwing's powers as the Earth Warden, there was only one individual capable of such a feat. Keeper Archidas was considered by the Burning Legion to be one of the weakest keepers in terms of direct combat. But he was still a keeper. The Lich King was by far the most powerful necromancer Tichondrius had ever encountered, and he was surrounded by countless undead and the heaviest fortifications the Scourge could manage to establish on an incredibly mobile platform. He would normally be completely unassailable, but the reckless decision to attack Dalaran had opened a vulnerability that the Alliance hadn't hesitated to exploit. Now, Shenzhen Su would need to flee back to the oceans and disappear into its depths before the Alliance managed to successfully destroy the Lich King. Once again, Tichondrius cursed the incompetence of everyone around him as the Scourge was placed in a race against time. Tichondrius' thoughts were cut short by the mocking voice of the mortal who he had been attempting to kill. "Would you like to surrender now?" Tichondrius grit his teeth as he restrained his utter fury. The enemy's morale had been greatly bolstered by the arrival of the necropolis, and he would be quickly overwhelmed if he allowed his anger to control him. Instead, Tichondrius offered the mortal a promise that he meant from the bottom of his soul as he prepared to teleport back to Shenzhen Su and organize the defense against the invasion. "I don't know when, but I will ruin you and everything that you have ever built," Tichondrius replied coldly, fully agreeing with Gul'dan for once as he felt a surge of hatred for this particular mortal. "I swear it." With that, Tichondrius disappeared from Dalaran in a swirl of dark magic, more determined than ever to bring death to this infuriating world.